how do we harness insights from the world's supercommunicators to become more powerful in daily life?
Well, the first thing to recognize is that communication is Homo sapiens' superpower, right? Like it's the thing that has allowed us to be so successful as a species. Largely because it allows us to connect with other people. It's what's at the core of building families and cultures and societies and eventually cities and countries. And so communication is, when we talk about being more powerful every day, communication is the source of a huge amount of power. Now, that being said, that does not mean that all of us are good at it, right?
Right.
We all communicate all the time, but that doesn't necessarily mean that we're actually speaking in ways that people can hear us or that we're hearing what other people are trying to say to us. And so for me, this really came home. This is actually why I wrote the book, is because I got into this pattern where I'd come home from work and I would see my wife and I'd like had a bad day and I'd be like, my boss is a jerk and my coworkers don't appreciate me. And she very reasonably would say, oh, like, why don't you take your boss out to lunch and you guys can get to know each other? She'd have a solution. And instead of being able to hear her, I would get even more upset, right? I would be like, why aren't you listening to me? Why aren't you supporting me? You should be outraged on my behalf. And then she would get upset because I was being irrational. And so I kind of had this question, like, if I'm so good at communication, if I'm a professional communicator, why does this keep happening? Not just with her, but with coworkers, with my kids. And that was kind of the origin of the book.
Wow, fascinating. What does like poor communication look like? Somebody who's like not the most effective communicator.
Yeah.
What are they doing wrong?
So let's talk about what they do wrong and then what it looks like when it looks good, which is we've all had that moment when we've been talking to someone and you like ask question after question and they're like, yes, no. And you're like, oh, please. It's like pulling teeth to like talk to this person. Or there's been times when we feel that awkwardness, right? Like we're the person who's having trouble connecting and we're desperate to like really make a connection with this person. And yet we keep on just putting our foot in our mouth or it just doesn't flow. So that's what bad communication looks like. And all of us do it on a regular basis. And it's nothing to be ashamed of. It's nothing to feel bad about. It's just part of life. What good communication looks like is the way I like to describe who super communicators are is, in effect, I'll ask you this. So if you were having a bad day and you wanted to call someone who you know would make you feel better, does that person, like, do you know who that is?
Do I know who that is? Yeah, I would probably call Sydney, my producer. Okay. She's a fantastic communicator, and part of the reason why we have such a fantastic ongoing working relationship is that she's a great communicator as well. I would call family, close friends. Yeah. Yeah.
So those people that you would contact, Sydney, or maybe, someone that you're close to in your family, for you, they are a super communicator and you are a super communicator back to them. You know how to connect with them almost effortlessly. You know how to show them that you're listening. They know how to show you that they've heard what you've said. And there are some people who can do this with almost anyone, right? I mean, we've all met these folks who they're not necessarily the most charismatic people or like the most outgoing, but they're fun to talk to. They just make a conversation go so easily. Oftentimes, in fact, we don't think that they're the smartest person because they make conversations so easy that we think we're really smart.
Wow.
But what we've learned is that there's just a set of skills. Like those people, they weren't born special. They're not charismatic, more charismatic than anyone else. In fact, if you talk to most of them, they'll say that there was a period in their life when they had trouble making friends, or maybe their parents got divorced and they had to be the peacemaker. But something has happened that got them to think about communication just a little bit more deeply than everyone else, just half an inch more deeply. And that's what makes them into a super communicator. Because we know that if you understand how conversation works, if you learn some pretty basic skills, you can connect with anyone. Like anyone can become a super communicator.
Wow. What proportion of good communication is innate versus learned?
It's almost all learned.
Wow.
I mean, so let me caveat that a little bit, because there's a lot of neural pathways that are associated with communication that have evolved, which is, if you communicated really well, a millennia ago, you are more likely to survive. And so that, and what in communication means in that context is it means connection. So there are parts of our brains, that feeling you get when you have had a fantastic conversation. Like
yeah.
You feel
expressed.
You feel expressed. You feel like, it just feels wonderful, right? Our brains have evolved to actually deliver that reward sensation. Because that feeling of connection, that's what gets us to do things that make us more likely to live, like stick together as parents or build a society around ourselves so we can all protect ourselves. So we actually crave connection. It's hardwired into our brains. And we have a lot of instincts about how to communicate. But what we know is that those instincts only get actualized when we learn how to use them and when we practice them and make them into habits.
And when do we typically, over the course of somebody's life, like when does that learning typically occur?
That learning like starts like at age 6 weeks.
Wow.
So if you have a baby, and everyone knows this, like if you have a baby and you smile at the baby will smile back at you. Sometimes it's like 3 months, right? But the baby will smile back at you. What they're actually doing is they're learning nonverbal communication. They're learning a form of social mimicry and expression mimicry that's key to how we communicate. And then this thing happens where we learn and we learn and we learn, and then we usually hit like our mid-20s and we stop learning. And 2 things happen. Number 1, we stop paying attention to what's going on, and so learning new things. Number 2, we pay a lot of attention to people's words instead of everything else about communication. And so if we go up to someone and we ask them, how you doing? And they're like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm doing really good. But their arms are crossed and they're downcast and they aren't looking at us. We tend to listen to their words rather than absorbing the communication they're offering us. And that can be really hard. That can be something that gets in our way.
Yeah, nonverbal communication is a huge part of how we communicate.
It's huge. Sometimes it's verbal, but it's non-linguistic, right? So take laughter. Laughter is a great example. And there's this story in the book about how NASA studies how astronaut applicants laugh to figure out if they have high emotional intelligence.
That's wild.
It's crazy. It's crazy. But like what's amazing about laughter is that about 70% of the time when you or I laugh, it is not in response to something funny. Like there's been no attempt at humor. Rather, in a conversation, I'm laughing to show you I want to connect with you.
Wow.
And you laugh back to show you want to connect with me. And there's certain things about our laughs that have to match each other, but right? Because you just laughed, right? Yeah. You just laughed.
Totally autonomically as well.
It's totally, yes.
It's not like you just cracked a joke.
No, not at all. And in fact, it can get in your head a little bit, but like over a day, notice when you laugh or someone else laughs, and you'll actually notice that the friends that you like the most, the super communicators in your life, they laugh all the time.
Wow.
They make you feel like you're funny, even though you have not said anything funny.
Well, it begs the question, like, what is the evolutionary purpose of laughter?
It's exactly so it actually comes, there's a theory, and this hasn't been proven. There's a sound that chimps make and primates make when a predator has entered the area and the predator has left. And it's a noise to basically let the rest of the herd know the predator is gone. And it sounds like laughter.
It's like a release of tension or something.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So the theory is that we evolved the capacity to laugh because we built on this communal sharing of the threat isn't there, we can relax. And that became associated with joy and pleasure and humor.
What are the traits of the common traits among super communicators? Because you've spoken to so many over the course of the book. And I think about, I had the privilege of getting to go offline. We were talking about my experience on the Joe Rogan experience, right? The Joe Rogan's podcast. And I think arguably he's one of the greatest living conversationalists. I mean, there's something very admirable about the fact that and aspirational about the fact that he's seemingly able to have a conversation, a 3-hour-long conversation with anybody.
Yeah, and it never lags, right? It never like gets like kind of in the doldrums. No, I think he is, and my guess is that he has thought a lot about how to communicate because he's just so good at it. So here's the characteristics that we know consistent super communicators share, people who can kind of do this on a regular basis. For one thing, we know that they ask a lot more questions, like 10 to 20 times as many questions as the average person. And some of those questions we don't even really register because it's like, hey, what'd you think about that? Or, what'd you say next, right? These little asides that serve to invite other people into the conversation. But then some of the questions are these things that are known as deep questions, questions that ask about someone's values or beliefs or experiences. And they often don't appear deep. Like a deep question could be like, what do you do for a living? I'm a lawyer. Oh, yeah. What made you decide to go to law school? Like, do you love practicing the law? Those are deep questions that ask someone to talk about their experiences or their values, but they don't appear deep, right? It just gives someone else a chance to expose something. So that's the first thing that super communicators do. They tend to ask a lot more questions, and they tend to ask deep questions. Number two is they tend to prove that they're listening. And the way that they do that is by asking follow-up questions, right, to show that I heard you. Or number two, by repeating back in some way what you told me to make sure I'm getting it right. Like, oh, what I heard you say, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is that, you love clowns, whatever it is. So they prove that they're listening because that makes you feel heard, and it makes you more likely to listen back. And then the third, and this is the most important thing, frankly, they change the kind of conversation they're having to match the other person, and they invite you to match them. And to explain what I mean there, I have to sort of explain. So I would have these fights with my wife, and I started calling all these experts, and they said, oh, we know exactly what's going on. We know the mistake you're making. In the last decade, we've learned a ton about communication from data collection and new neural imaging methods. And they said, what we figured out is that everyone thinks of a discussion as being about one thing, like my day at work, or what it's like to be on the Joe Rogan Experience. But actually, every discussion is made up of multiple different kinds of conversations. And most of those kinds of conversations fall into one of three buckets. There's these practical discussions where we're like making plans or solving problems. There's emotional discussions where I want to tell you how I feel, and I don't want you to solve my feelings. I want you to empathize. And then there's social conversations about how we relate to each other and we relate to society. And what super communicators do is they can recognize what kind of conversation is happening and match you. So for instance, when I was coming home from work and with my wife, I was having an emotional conversation and she was having a practical conversation. So we're literally using different parts of our brains. And so it's hard to connect with each other. But if you just take a break, and this is like something the experts taught me to do. If you just take a break and you say something like, do you want me to help you think up a solution, or like, are you just looking to vent? All of a sudden it lets us get on the same page. Then we start having the same kind of conversation. And super communicators do that constantly.
It's really interesting. It makes me think about the fundamental difference between the way that men and women typically communicate with one another, and the fact that it's often women, particularly in the context of a relationship, that communicate emotionally, and men attempt to meet their emotional needs with practicality. And they're, at least from my own experience and my own research into the topic and my lived experience, that's where there tends to be a disconnect.
Totally.
And ultimately conflict. And
so let me ask you something. So when you've been in this situation, your significant other comes and has a problem, and they want to complain about it, or they want to explain it. What do you think it is that's pushing you to try and solve it?
Yeah, I just like to fix things.
Yeah.
It's like my male brain wanting to like break out the toolbox and like get to work. Because obviously, if there's a signal of distress, you want to do everything in your power, right?
Totally. Ameliorate it.
To ameliorate it, yeah.
Yeah. And you probably get a lot of comfort from solving, right? Like in your life, you have probably been able to find times when you're feeling stressed or you're feeling sad, where taking control, like finding some sort of solution, makes you feel better. And so your instinct is, I want to share that with someone else, right? With my partner. Even though we know the last 30 times I tried it, it didn't actually work.
Yeah.
And so the real solution, and this is the big insight that like this research has led us to, the best solution you can offer your partner is not to come up with a solution. It's not to have a practical conversation. It's to say, let's have an emotional conversation. Like, my job is to hear and acknowledge and empathize with what you're feeling, and possibly even share something vulnerable about myself. And in doing so, that'll actually be the best solution you can provide right then. And once you do that, you might very well say, can we talk about solutions now? Or do you mind if I was to share with you some thoughts on what to do differently? And we move together to a practical conversation. But the point is, if we're moving together, then we feel like we're in sync.
Wow. I love that. You mentioned the concept of emotional intelligence briefly. which rings a bell for me. I studied psychology as an undergraduate, and I think emotional intelligence is, I think it's critically important. But what for somebody who is perhaps naive to that concept, what is that?
So emotional intelligence is our ability to read another person's emotion and, just as importantly, share our own emotions. So emotions impact every single conversation, whether we're, even if you're at work, like discussing accounting policies, there's some emotions there, right? There's something going on inside your head. And so people with a high EQ, they can see that and they can react to it. And I mentioned this NASA thing, which is kind of a fun way of demonstrating this. So in the early 1980s, NASA, President Reagan said he wanted to send people to a space station. So up until then, most space missions had been pretty short. And now they're looking at the situation where someone might go up for like 6 months or a year and stuck in this can with 5 other people. So they say, okay, look, we need to hire people who actually have good emotional intelligence, high IQ. The problem is that by the time you get to the final rounds of applying to be an astronaut, you know how to answer every question perfectly, right? Like you can fake EQ as well as anyone on Earth. And so there was this one psychologist working at NASA who couldn't figure out, how do I tell the difference between people who are faking it and people who actually have it? And what he figured out is that if he paid attention to how people laughed in response to his laughter, it would tell him whether he wanted to connect.
Wow.
Yeah. So he'd start the interview, he'd come in with like a bunch of papers and he'd accidentally spill them, but actually do it on purpose. And he'd be wearing this like garish tie. And he would say like, I look like such a clown, and like go, ha 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 ha. And then because he's recording the session, he later looks to see how the candidate reacted. And some candidates go, yeah, that's funny, right? You're supposed to laugh back, so they're polite.
Yeah.
And then some people would be like, I have the same issue. Like, I totally understand. Those people had high EQ.
Interesting.
They were matching the intensity and the mood and the energy of his non-linguistic communication. And that meant that was a signal that they wanted to connect.
Wow. And why is having high EQ important in day-to-day communication?
Because it helps us. Because the thing about emotion is that when we exhibit an emotion, there's this thing known as emotional reciprocity, where if I exhibit an emotion of vulnerability, and by exhibit emotion, it could be something as small as saying like, I love Joe Rogan, right? And I love Joe Rogan, and here's another podcast I don't like, or just saying I love Joe Rogan. When I do that, I'm exposing a little bit of vulnerability, because you very well could say like, only jerks like Joe Rogan, right? You could judge me. I might not care about your judgment, but you could judge me. When I expose that vulnerability, if you acknowledge it and reciprocate, we will feel closer to each other. It's hardwired into our brains. We almost can't fight it. And in fact, vulnerability is the loudest form of communication. Our brains, again, are designed to pay more attention to vulnerability when it's expressed than almost anything else, which makes sense, right? Because in a state of nature, someone who's vulnerable is either someone you need to protect, or it might be someone you want to attack, right? Vulnerability is just very loud. And in contemporary world, when someone says something vulnerable, even if it's something like, oh man, I love Joe Rogan, like, what do you think about him? It's an opportunity for you to connect with me if you choose to accept it.
Yeah, I mean, how does my cat show me that she loves me? She rolls over and she shows me her belly.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. She exposes her vulnerability. You can't attack her, but you're not going to.
No. Gonna kiss it, rub my face in it.
I'm allergic to cats, so
I know. We found that out. She's currently locked away.
I'm sorry.
No, but I love that. It's so true. I feel like it took me a minute to understand what it meant as a guy to express vulnerability. I thought for a while vulnerability just meant sharing things about yourself, maybe even oversharing details that didn't necessarily need to be shared. But what I think I've learned about it is that it means exposing yourself to emotional risk, by sharing things that might not necessarily, as you so articulately pointed out, that might not be reciprocated.
Yeah, that's a really nice way of putting it. that exposing yourself to emotional risk. I hadn't thought about that, but that's exactly right. And it doesn't mean that that risk has to be actualized, but it's the act of showing your belly that is the meaningful part. And,
wow.
And that doesn't mean that like you don't have to talk about like your trauma from when you were 5. Sometimes being vulnerable with someone is just saying, man, I'm sorry you had a tough weekend. I have definitely had tough weekends myself. If you ever want to talk about it, I'm here to discuss it with you. Or that's vulnerable, right? I'm telling you, like, I have had tough times too. I'm not going to pressure you to talk about them because maybe we're at work, but I'm letting you know that I've heard what you said. That's a form of vulnerability.
Yeah, it's like not sharing necessarily that you've gone through a breakup. Like that's not the vulnerable part of that conversation. It's that you really love this person and they broke your heart.
Totally.
And
I know what it's like to have a broken heart.
Yeah.
And sometimes it's like asking a question. So when my father passed away in 2018, I flew home from the funeral and had this experience where like this was the most interesting, most meaningful, most important thing that had happened in a long time. And I was kind of desperate to talk about it, right? Like there's so much going on. You just want to process it. And I would bump into friends or I'd bump into like coworkers and I'd say like, oh, my dad just passed away. And they always said the same thing. They always said, my condolences, or I'm so sorry. And then because they were uncomfortable, they didn't want to pry, they'd move on to other topics. But like a vulnerable, real thing would have been to say like, what was your dad like? What did you hear during the funeral that surprised you? And I know you've gone through this with your mom, like
2018 as well.
Yeah. Can you imagine, like when someone says like, if you say like, my mom's passed away and they say like, oh, what was she like? Tell me about her. Particularly at that time, like, wouldn't you love to have shared what you loved about this person with someone?
Yeah. No, it's so powerful. It is such an important skill to cultivate, to know how to be vulnerable and to express yourself, because otherwise those feelings get bottled up.
Yeah.
And they aggregate and it creates this pressure, which I think is really not fun to experience.
And that's where those deep questions can be so powerful, because you don't have to ask someone like, are you really sad? Right?
Yeah.
Does this make you question your mortality? All you have to say is, what do you make of this? Right? When I ask you why you decided to become a lawyer, what I'm really saying is like, what do you make of your job? And when someone, and in fact, there's a story in the book about this surgeon who like was taught, basically relearned how to communicate with his patients. And when someone would come in with a new cancer diagnosis, because he specialized in prostate cancer, the first question he asks now is, tell me what you make of this diagnosis. And what people say is so surprising, because he expects them to say something about, like questions about pain or treatment. But instead what they do is they usually say things like, my dad died when I was young and I saw what it put my mom through and I don't want to do that to my wife, or I declared bankruptcy 10 years ago. And it sort of feels like now I have to like have another struggle. They're not asking questions about medicine. Like bankruptcy, Dr. Adai never thought that would come up, but just asking that question, what do you make of this? That becomes an invitation for the other person to tell you A, what they're thinking about, and B, what they really want out of this conversation.
Yeah. I read that is it this surgeon that was trying to basically convince his patients of like lower risk treatments?
Yes. Yeah. It's a fascinating story. So this guy is Dr. Bafar Adai, who's in New York at Sloan Kettering.
Do patients typically want higher risk treatments?
Well, so prostate cancer is a really interesting thing, because for many, many people, when you get a diagnosis of prostate cancer, the best advice they can give you is do nothing at all about it. Because prostate tumors are so slow growing that removing them has some risks. The prostate's located close to the nerves that control urinary functions and sexual functions. So you can have that surgery and they get rid of the cancer, but you are incontinent or you have sexual dysfunction for the rest of your life. So for many patients, what they say, particularly for older patients, do this thing called active surveillance. Just like we'll take blood every 6 weeks, we'll do a biopsy, or every 6 months, we'll do a biopsy every 2 years, but otherwise don't do anything. And Dr. Dye would say this to patient after patient who'd come into his office, and then they would come back the next day and they'd be like, "No, I want the surgery. Like, put me under the knife." And he was like, I'm a surgeon and I'm telling you, you don't need surgery.
Wow.
So he went to Harvard Business School and he asked them for help on how to change how he was communicating, because he realized this was his problem. He was doing something wrong. And they told him to ask that question. And then when somebody responds, listen if they're responding emotionally, or if they're asking practical questions, or if they're worried about how other people are going to see them now, the practical, the emotional, the social, and match them. What's known as the matching principle in psychology. And in doing so, create that connection, because you're going to need to be on the same wavelength before you can sit down and say, here are the treatment options. And when he started doing that, the number of patients demanding surgery went down by 30% almost immediately.
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't realize that the best course of action often in that context is inaction.
Yeah, and we should say that this isn't medical advice.
Yeah,
right?
of course.
If somebody has prostate cancer, you should go talk to your doctor, because it's not always true, but for many situations, the prostate tumor is so slow growing that there's actually a saying within medicine that for many older patients, they will die of old age before their prostate cancer kills them.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fascinating. What role does social media play in our communication skills today?
It's a really good question. Let me ask you, like, do you feel like social media makes you a better communicator or no?
I think that the tools of social media have helped me to become a better communicator, but because my work and my passion is communicating science, and so you know how they say the best way to learn is to teach?
Yeah.
I gain a lot by distilling scientific, by working to distill scientific concepts into bite-sized, actionable, pithy, whether it's tweets or posts or what have you.
Yeah.
And so I gain a lot from that. But in terms of like my interpersonal communication, I think it's a double-edged sword. I think the key to, for me, what I've found is that, a key to a successful relationship in many ways, like shared humor is great. And, the language of humor, social media has changed the language of humor in many ways with meme culture and the like. And I think that's really fun.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's some people who I have way deeper relationships with because of social media, right? Because they get to inform me about their lives without us having to get on the phone. So it's a really interesting question, and there's a lot of research on it. And it might be helpful just to talk a little bit about the science behind what happens when we communicate, which is, so in this conversation right now, even though we're not aware of it, because we're having a real conversation, we're connecting with each other, our pupils have started to dilate at the same rate. And our breath patterns have started to match each other.
Wow.
And that would be true even if we were on Zoom, right? And this is the most important part. Your thoughts and my thoughts have begun looking very similar.
Wow.
Like if we were scanning both of our brains, what we would see is our neural activity is beginning to match each other. And this is known in neurology as neural entrainment. And it's kind of what communication is that I can describe an emotion or an idea, and you can actually experience that emotion or experience that idea rather than just like listening like a computer. When I say I'm sad, you actually feel a little sad, right? Particularly if we're connected to each other. So this ability to get entrained is at the core of what conversation is. Communication is about connection. So to your point about social media, as you can imagine, when people use social media for connection to try and neurally entrain with others, it can be really, really powerful. The challenge is that sometimes we We don't know how to do that. So when telephones first became popular about 100 years ago, there was all these articles about the fact that like people said like, you'll never use phones for real conversation because like you can't see the person, so it's pointless. It'll be like the telegraph. We'll just use it to send like news bulletins or shopping lists. And what's interesting is they did a bunch of studies of people using telephones, and those people were exactly right. If you look at the transcripts of those early conversations, they're all stilted. People don't know how to talk to each other on the phone. But then by the time you and I are teenagers, of course, we're like talking on the phone for 7 hours a night, right? Like, so what happens is that humans can learn to communicate through different channels very effectively. And in fact, what we know is that if you and I couldn't see each other, if this was a phone conversation, we would both be enunciating our words a little bit more. We would make our emotion in our voice a little bit more obvious. What's happened online is that, you know, most digital communication is like 20 years old, 25 years old. So we haven't learned a lot of the instincts about how to use different channels in different ways. But my kids, I have 2 teenagers, they know these, they've learned these instincts, right? That's why digital native is so powerful, is because they know, like, if I'm talking to a friend and I'm sarcastic, they're going to pick up on it. But if I'm typing to them, I need to do something to prove that sarcasm, to show that sarcasm.
Oh yeah, sarcasm is often lost.
It's often lost unless you have a little winky face, right?
Yeah,
or like something like all these emojis that have emerged are a way of signaling emotion and nonverbal content.
Sometimes you just add like a period to something and it completely changes the tenor of the statement.
Totally,
It
right?
makes it more serious.
Yeah. And so people who remind themselves that different kinds of channels of communication require slightly different approaches, those people, for them, social media is actually a huge help. It's for everyone who like says like, oh, I'm going to like send a tweet the same way that I would like say something to my buddy at the bar. Those are the ones who get in trouble.
Yeah, that makes total sense. I mean, subjectively, I definitely feel that, you know, because I've had this podcast now for 4 years, and initially we were doing a lot more of a way higher proportion of interviews remotely via platforms like Zoom or whatever. But I've always felt that the conversations flowed much more naturally when done in person. There's a really unnatural staccato rhythm to even a Zoom conversation, which has both video and audio components, obviously, but there's this very transactional rhythm to the conversation that I think doesn't exist, or is less likely to or it's not as pronounced.
Well, and it's super interesting because in some ways, what studies have shown is that phone conversations are actually better at that than Zoom conversations. And the reason why is because, first of all, the fidelity is just lower on Zoom, right? But secondly is that because we can see someone, we assume we can infer things, and we stop putting little signals in our voice. So think about like when you're talking to a friend on the phone, you can't see each other. And like you start saying something and they're like, oh yeah. And then you're like, yeah. And like they let them jump in, right? What happens on Zoom is that we wait for the other person to stop talking because we don't want to like cross channel. We're worried that like the voices will cancel each other out. But also we assume that we can tell what's going on with them by looking at their face on the camera. And sometimes we can, but sometimes we can't. And so it actually, we speak less clearly on Zoom than we would on the telephone.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's fascinating.
Wow. What has writing this book taught you about conflict resolution?
Yeah, a ton. So there's a chapter in the book about this experiment that they did where they took a whole bunch of people who are gun rights enthusiasts and another equally sized group of gun control activists, and they brought them together for this meeting. And these are people who are professional activists, right? They lobby on it. They work for groups. And so they're all folks who've spent years screaming at each other. And the goal of the experiment is not for them to agree with each other. It's not even for them to find common ground. The goal is just to see if they can have a civil conversation. And so before the conversation starts, they teach them this one skill, a bunch of skills, but this one in particular that's known as looping for understanding. And they say, okay, here's what we want you to do. One person should tell a story from their own life about someone who is meaningful to them, or why gun control or gun rights is so important to them. Tell a story. And the other person, your job is to loop for understanding, which means ask questions if you feel like you should, particularly deep questions would be great. And then step 2, repeat back in your own words what you heard the person say. And then step 3, and this is the one we usually forget, ask if you got it right. And if they say, yeah, you got it right, then good job. If they say, no, there's a little bit more that I don't think you understand, then you loop again, right? You keep on doing it until everyone agrees. And then you switch places. And here's what we know. So looping for understanding is this technique. It's taught at Harvard Law School and Business School and at Stanford and University of Michigan. It's taught to students who are going to be negotiators or going to be, working in business settings, because when I loop for understanding, I'm proving to you that I'm listening to you. And the biggest problem that happens in conflict is that when we are in conflict with each other, we're both super anxious. And I suspect, even if I don't admit it to myself, that you aren't actually listening to me. You're waiting for your turn to talk. And so when you start talking, I start waiting for my turn to talk, right? I start marshaling all the counter arguments in my head. I start all the reasons I think you're wrong. But looping for understanding, first of all, it proves to each person that we're listening, that we really want to understand. But second of all, it creates an assignment for me, which is I have to pay enough attention that I can repeat back what you're going to say in my own words.
Yeah.
I can't come up with the counter arguments. I have to pay attention to you. It's like a self-hack. So when it comes to conflict, this is one of the big things, is find a way to prove that you are listening. And the other person will also want to listen back to you in return.
What do you do in a situation where the other party doesn't seem to want to listen to you?
That's totally fair. And sometimes, not everything has to be a conversation, right? Sometimes you're I really want to discuss this with you. And the other person's I want to discuss it too and give you a piece of my mind, right?
Yeah.
They don't necessarily want to have a discussion. And so you can wait until they are ready for a conversation.
Yeah. Well, it just evokes the many arguments that you tend to see on social media, particularly in the world of nutrition.
Yeah.
There's lots of, we have what are called these, or what I sometimes refer to as these diet tribes. And oftentimes there's a lot of antagonism, but it's not any side really makes any effort to hear what the other side is saying.
Not at all.
Yeah.
Not at all. So there's oftentimes something else going on there, which is, let's assume that there are some people who wouldn't mind having a conversation. I actually want to learn a little bit. I want you to learn from me. Oftentimes, and we know this from research that's been done on marriage therapy, oftentimes the thing that's blocking us from hearing other people and blocking them from hearing us is control, a battle over control. So when we're in an argument and I sit down and I'm kind of tense to begin with, I totally have this instinct to try and control the situation, right? And the easiest thing for me to control is to try and control you. To say look, if you just listen to me, you'll understand what I'm saying. Or if you just see things from my perspective. Or I might negatively control you. I might say I'm not going to talk about that. Or I'm going to discuss this for 5 minutes and then I'm going to leave. Or you might say you're upset about something. And I say, you shouldn't be upset about that. That's not a big deal. I'm trying to control your emotions.
Yeah. Gaslighting me.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly. And so the thing is that we know is that this instinct to control the other person is absolutely toxic. If you look at divorces, oftentimes this is the single biggest cause of a divorce, is both people are trying to control each other. Now, that being said, we can't just say don't control anything, because you have this instinct, right? You're worked up. You need something to control. So instead of trying to control the other person, what the best communicators do, super-communicators do, is they try and control usually one of three other things. They try and control the environment. So instead of us having a fight at 2 a.m., let's wait till we're rested at 10 o'clock in the morning and then we can discuss this. They sometimes control themselves. They say things like, okay, before I respond, I just want to take a second to think about what I'm saying. They tend to speak a little bit more slowly so they can sort of evaluate their words before they come out. Or thirdly, they might try and control the boundaries of the argument itself. In psychology, this is known as kitchen sinking, that like, it's super toxic, that we start arguing about like where to go for Thanksgiving. And then it becomes like, your mom drives me crazy and we don't have enough money because you don't work hard enough, right? So a fight about one thing becomes a fight about everything. But people who are really good married couples, when they have a fight about one thing, they have a fight about one thing. They control the boundaries. Now, the reason why this kind of control is so powerful, particularly these three things, is because in a situation like that, we are controlling together. We're not trying to control each other. We're actually cooperating and making a decision like, when are we going to have this conversation? I'm going to demonstrate to you that I'm trying to control myself. Let's decide together what we're talking about and what we're not talking about. So we're on the same side of the table. And that doesn't necessarily mean we're going to agree with each other, but it means that we're actually going to have a conversation.
How do we take emotions out of those instances?
You can't. I mean, that's the thing, is that like you can't take emotions out of any conversation. Now, sometimes the emotions aren't important. If we're discussing next year's budget and like all of us are like, whatever. But let's say we're discussing next year's budget and someone at the table thinks that like if the budget goes wrong, they're going to have to do layoffs. Certainly emotions are influencing how that person speaks and how they listen. And so we shouldn't try and remove emotions. We should acknowledge them. And sometimes it's as easy as saying like, take conversations about race, right? Where there's a lot of emotions. Sometimes it's as simple as just saying, this is going to be an awkward conversation and I'm probably going to say some things the wrong way. And you might too. And I want to just start by saying like, I'm not going to hold that against you. Like, I really want to understand. And like, if you start feeling anxious or if you start feeling like this is too much, let's just take a break. That's totally okay to do. When we acknowledge those emotions, sometimes it helps us decide, oh, actually, we're definitely going to feel those things. But now that we've acknowledged them, we can at least put them to the side a little bit and we can focus on something else.
Yeah, acknowledging your emotions, leading from a place of feeling, I think, that's part of, I think, what the little that I know about nonviolent communication, which is basically taking accusatory language out of the dialogue and instead making it, focusing more on how the other party has made you feel.
That's exactly right. And the reason why that's so powerful is because at the end of the day, a conversation about who's more of an expert is oftentimes pointless.
Yeah.
So we should talk about things where we are genuine experts. And the thing you are most an expert on is you. Like if you say, you said this thing and it made me feel hurt, I might say if I'm a jerk, like you shouldn't have felt hurt, but I can't disagree with you. I can't tell you, no, that's not what you felt, because you are the expert on you and I am the expert on me. That's why rooting comments, particularly hard conversations, so much in our personal stories, saying this is how I feel. This is what I experienced when you said that. This is what happened to me that has made me upset or made me scared. It's really powerful because everyone acknowledges you are the expert on you, and it creates an equality in the conversation. Everyone has the right to speak up and to be there because we've all had an experience that we can share.
How do we deepen deeper the connections in our romantic lives?
So there's this really fun study called the Fast Friends Protocol. Some people might know it as the 36 questions that lead to love. So there were these two researchers, Arthur and Elaine Aron, who did this experiment. And what they would do is this was sort of pre-internet. They would take strangers and they would put pairs of strangers in a room and they would hand them a list of questions to ask and answer each other. And this would usually take about 45 minutes. And some of the questions were like, who would you invite to dinner? Like of anyone you could invite. And some of them were like, when's the last time you cried in front of another person? Right? So some of them are a little bit more shallow. Some of them are more deep, but they're all things that invite someone to kind of explain who they are. So people do the experiment and they think that that's the end of the experiment. It's just doing this thing, but it's not. They come out of the room and the Aarons say like, thanks so much. Like, we'll see you. Take care. And they go their separate ways. And then 7 weeks later, the Aarons call up everyone who was in that experiment and they ask them, have you seen the person you did that with since the experiment? And remember, they were all strangers to each other.
Wow.
And this is pre-internet. So like to find the other person, you would have to like walk up and down a dorm hall or like go to the white pages and call everyone with a similar name until you find the one you talked to. They found that 70% of the people had sought out their partner and had gone to have a beer with them or see a movie with them. 3 couples ended up getting married who met that way. And so the Aarons, they called this the fast friends procedure. And it becomes like a huge thing in psychology. And the Aarons start wondering like, what is going on there? And this gets to romantic relationships, right? Like what makes a romantic relationship deeper or more shallow? And there were a couple of things that mattered a lot. The first was, am I asking you how you feel about life instead of the facts of your life? That's kind of what a deep question is. It's asking you like how you feel about something rather than the facts of that thing. So people who get deeper in a romantic relationship are people who ask each other what they feel about the world as opposed to just the facts of the world. The second thing is
like applied to, made really tactically, like applied to dinner conversation,
Totally.
like as opposed to, tell me what you did today.
Yeah.
Maybe a deeper alternative question would be like,
what was the best part of your day? Like was there any part of today that was disappointing to you? I mean, I do this with my kids, right? Because like the problem is they come home from school and the easiest thing is to be like, what'd you learn today? Or like, how was today? And they're like, it was fine. I didn't learn anything. So instead, what I usually say is something that's like a deep question. I ask them to analyze something. Tell me how they feel. Like what was the best part of today? Or like, I know that you went out with Jasper after school. Like, it seems like you guys are really good friends. Like, what do you admire about Jasper? Like, what do you think is cool about him? I'm inviting them to say something real, right? And it makes it really natural to respond in the same way when someone says like, I like Jasper because he's like really nice to other people. Then I can say, oh man, I totally understand. My friend Greg, like one of the reasons I love him so much is like, he's just a kind guy. I think kindness is really important, right? That's how the conversation starts going. So that's the first thing, is that asking about how someone feels about things instead of the facts of the thing. The second thing is back and forth, which we've had less of in this conversation than we probably should, which is my fault. But the Aarons would do this thing where they would, or someone else actually took their questions and they would have one person answer all 36 of them while someone listened. And then they would hand the list over and the other person would answer all 36 questions in a row. There wasn't any back and forth. People did not feel close at all after that.
Interesting.
So there's something about this emotional reciprocity or conversational reciprocity that makes us both feel like we're connecting with each other. I mean, let me ask you?
Please.
So, I mean, you do a lot of interviews. What do you think makes what determines the difference between one where like you feel like you're just asking questions and one where you're really like connecting with a person, having a conversation?
Yeah. I mean, my favorite quote unquote interviews are not really interviews at all, but conversations, and they're less transactional and more, a mutual sharing of, whether it's values or vulnerability. I like sharing personal anecdotes, stories, embarrassing or not. I mean, I love, any opportunity that allows me to be more vulnerable, because I feel like it's a 1-2 punch in the sense that it allows me to connect more deeply with the person that I'm interviewing, but it also allows me to connect more deeply with my audience.
Yeah.
So,
and maybe even a little with yourself. Is that fair? Like,
yeah, like a moment to, introspect and
totally,
and think about things.
Sometimes we don't really know what we're thinking or feeling until we like say it to another person.
Yeah. And also when we hang out with the same people,
yeah,
day in, day out, I mean, as much as we love them, there is a degree of familiarity that I think preempts certain questions that you might receive from somebody who doesn't know you as well.
Totally. And when you're talking to your romantic partner and you want to get deep with them, like, what do you say? Like, what do you do in order to show that?
It's a good question. Well, I've been single for an incredibly long time, but as of about 4 months ago, I now actually have a girlfriend.
Hey, congratulations!
And yeah, it's been a long time, but your boy has met somebody really cool, so that's been fun to get to experience. But yeah, I think I mean, this whole concept of emotional intelligence, like I'm somewhat familiar from what I can recall from, my undergrad psychology education with Howard Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, right? So I don't have, I'm not, I don't think that I have that I'm peak intelligence in every domain, but I definitely think that I'm very emotionally intelligent. I feel that. I'm very good at reading people. And that's part of, I guess, what has allowed me to be successful in what it is that I do.
Yeah.
But so I think with women in the past, but certainly with my current relationship, I think I do tend to lead with questions that elicit an emotional response.
Yeah.
Like an authentic tapping into that person's values, how they feel.
Right. Asking them to share something real.
Yeah.
And what's interesting is what I'm hearing you say, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, is that because you had mentioned being vulnerable before, that it's not just that you are asking people, it's not just that you're like asking people like show me a vulnerability, right?
Yeah.
Like tell me your feelings, but that you feel really comfortable matching that.
Mm-hmm.
You feel really comfortable saying like, oh, you feel that way? Like either I've felt that way in the past, or like I actually feel differently about it, but I want to know more about like why.
I definitely have this convoluted view of what it meant to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
but I think being truly vulnerable can be as simple as saying to the other person, I really like you.
Yeah. Oh my God. That's the most vulnerable thing you can say, right?
Yeah, because they might not necessarily reciprocate.
And that's exactly right. It's terrifying. And a huge part, we use this word vulnerable, but it's in some senses the wrong word. The right word is authentic.
Yeah.
That if you say something authentic, like if you're like, this is what I'm thinking, this is what I'm feeling, this is true to who I am, that is the greatest vulnerability.
100%.
Because at that point, again, you might not care how they judge you, but they definitely can't judge you because you have been honest and authentic with them.
Yeah, and it also depends on, I guess, I wonder if you have any thoughts about like attachment styles and things like that. We've talked about that a bit on the show, and I think that they can be like any tool, knowing your attachment style, as those styles have been described in pop literature. I think like it can be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it's great to be able to understand your tendencies,
Yeah.
in intimate relationships, but on the other hand, it could be like self-limiting and maybe too defining. It could put you in a box in a way. But I was going to say that, if the other person is more avoidant attachment style, ultimately you want to be, from what I understand about it, is like you want to ultimately be like a securely attached person.
Yeah.
And so sharing something like that, like, hey, I'm really liking the way that this is going, or hey, I really like you, that might, to the wrong person, that might push them away. But to the right person, they recognize that for the outreaching of vulnerability that it is, and it makes the connection, if nothing else, stronger.
And I think when people do get freaked out by that, I think largely it's because they feel like they're supposed to respond somehow, and they either don't feel it or they don't know how to respond. But the truth of the matter is, when someone exposes a vulnerability, when they say something authentic and real, we do not have to say something similarly authentic and real. We can just acknowledge that they've said something real.
Yeah.
Like, like the fact that you like me, like that. Thank you. Thank you for telling me that. Like that really, I'm not saying like I like you back, but I am saying I hear you. It was probably scary to say that, and thank you for saying it.
Yeah, being able to receive love, or even a compliment, being able to receive a compliment.
And that's what an emotional conversation is, right? That when we're having an emotional conversation, we're using the deeper parts of our brains, the amygdala and the non-prefrontal cortex parts of our brain. And what those parts of the brain look for is they look for security, right? If I'm feeling emotional, the thing that most feels rewarding to me is to know that someone else is not going to attack me for being emotional. Now, if it's a practical discussion, prefrontal cortex, then like we're discussing ideas, we can push back on each other a little bit. But on an emotional conversation, like we create a space where we empathize. And that's why understanding which conversation is happening right now and being able to match someone, that's why it's so important.
Yeah. Yeah, I think when somebody shows you their belly, so to speak.
Exactly.
You it's
you rub it, right?
You rub it. Bury your face in it. 100%. Anything that surprised you about over the course of doing, all the many luminaries that you've sat with over the course of writing the book, but anything, stand out to you as being particularly surprising or counterintuitive?
Yeah, I think there's two things actually. The first is that this idea that anyone can become a super communicator, I guess I was a little skeptical, to be honest, when people would tell me that and I'd be like, sure, but and then I met people, there's one of the stories in the book is about this guy named Jim Lawler, who's a CIA, he worked for the CIA, retired recently. And when he got hired, he was 30 years old. It was his job to go over to Europe and try and recruit spies. And he was terrible at it, the absolute worst. He would go to these embassy parties and then go talk to people. And it was so awkward. And after a while they'd be like, I'm not going to work for you. And if you continue talking to me, I'm going to report you to the authorities. And so eventually he finds this one woman who had just come into town on vacation. She works for the foreign ministry of her Middle Eastern country. And he tells her he's an oil speculator, and they go to lunch and then more lunches and they go sightseeing together. And eventually he says, I work for the CIA, and she just freaks out. And she's like, I'm never going to speak to you again. You've put me in danger just by talking to me. So he tells his bosses what had happened, and they're like, no, we already told Washington DC you had recruited her. If you don't do this, you're going to get fired. So he convinces her to have one more dinner with him. And he's trying to cheer up. She's really glum because she's about to go home. He's trying to cheer her up and tell little stories, and just none of it's working. And after a while, he's like, you know what? I'm not even going to try and recruit her again because she's just going to leave. You can't trick someone into taking a suicidal risk. And so what he does instead is he just says, he gets really honest with her. And he's like, I'm going to be honest. I understand why you feel disappointed to be going home and disappointed in yourself. I worked for 5 years to get the CIA to accept me, and I'm terrible at this job. And I'm about to get I am terrible at this job. I'm so disappointed in myself. And she's listening to him and she starts crying, and he's like, I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to make you cry. And she says, no, I think we can help each other. We can do something important. And he's so inexperienced. He's like, no, you don't have to do that. You don't have to come work for us. And she's like, no, I hear what you're saying, and I feel like we can trust each other, and I want to help. She becomes the best asset for the next 20 years in the Middle East.
Wow.
And when I talked to Lawler about it, and Lawler became a top-notch recruiter, and he actually went on to teach other CIA officers. When you come in, you get taught by Lawler how to do this. And what he said was, it's literally just a series of skills, right? Learning how to prove you're listening, learning how to match someone, learning how to be authentic and genuine in a conversation, that anyone can learn to do that. And so I think that was the first big surprise was actually anyone can become a super communicator. It's just a set of skills that you practice a little bit until they become habits, and it just happens.
In the book, do you have is there a plan? Is it?
Oh yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. So there's after every section, there's this thing called a guide to using these ideas.
Oh, dope.
And it walks through and it tells you exactly this is what you should practice. This is how to think about it. This is the 3 things you should keep in mind. And when we're describing it this way, it can seem kind of overwhelming, right? Like there's a lot of stuff to think about. But again, because our brains have evolved to communicate, these become instincts very, very quickly. And then we just stop thinking about them, but we continue doing them. They essentially become habits.
And you're an expert in that as well.
Right. I wrote a book about habits too. Yeah, I wanted to figure out. But I'll mention one other idea just that kind of surprised me for what it's worth. And you can tell me if this isn't interesting. So there's this thing called the adult study of or Harvard study of adult happiness. You've probably heard of this.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah. It's one of the largest longitudinal studies for almost 100 years. They've been following around thousands of people to try and figure out what characteristics make someone more likely to live longer and to be happier and to be more successful in life. And the only thing that they have found that truly predicts that is if you have deep, meaningful connections with other people at age 45, you will be happier, healthier, and more successful at age 65, which of course doesn't mean it starts in 45, right? You've been building those for probably decades at that point. And what they found is that you don't have to have a ton of friends. You could have a ton of friends, but you just have to have meaningful connections with people. And the way that we have meaningful connections is almost always through conversations. Like we don't have to have a ton of conversations. I talk to some of my closest friends once every 6 months. I talk to them on the phone. I haven't seen them for years. But we feel connected to each other. We are connected to each other. And that is the thing that brings us the most happiness, but also the most health. Like being lonely, the Surgeon General just said this, being lonely is equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
Yeah, crazy.
Yeah. And so I guess the thing that's impressed me is just the importance of connection. How much it can shape our lives.
Is there any type of relationship that is, seemingly more valuable than others, or do they tend to be on the same playing field?
No. What's interesting about that study, so the Harvard study, is that it was originally called the Grant study. Like it's changed names like 4 or 5 times. And I went back and I read all the old reports. And in the 1940s and 1950s, they didn't say connections are important. They said love is important. Like men who have friends that they love, because at that point it was like all men who have friends that they love, or neighbors that they love, or church members that they love, are the ones who like are most successful and healthiest. And of course now, if like love means something different, right? It's almost only romantic. But back then it didn't mean that. It meant just a sense of camaraderie and a sense of connection.
I tell my male friends that I love them.
Yeah, no, I do all the time. Yeah. I think many people would be like, it's in some parts of the country there'd still be some hesitation.
Yes, you're right.
But to your point, it does not matter if it's a relation. It doesn't matter if it's a romantic relationship. It doesn't matter if it's a relationship with a neighbor. It doesn't matter if it's a relationship with someone you work with or just the barista you see every day. Like all those connections matter, and they matter if you invest in the connection. And so it's this constant opportunity that we have.
Wow. I love it. Well, thank you for bringing all of your many insights to the Genius Life. This was a fascinating conversation. And pleasure getting to know you, man.
Yeah,
You've done
me
a lot
too.
of fantastic work.
Thank you so much for having me. This is such a treat for me.
Oh, of course. I've got one last question.
Sure.
Before I get to that, where can people connect with you on social media, and where can they pick up your book?
So luckily, my last name is Duhigg, which is Duhigg. I'm like the only Charles Duhigg on earth. So if they Google me, or they Google The Power of Habit, the first book I wrote, or if they Google Super-communicators, I'll come up.
You're speaking to the only Max Lugavere on earth. So,
yeah,
right?
there you go, right? It's kind of nice, right?
It is kind of nice, yeah. Highly Googleable.
Yeah. And I'll also give people my email address, which is on my website, which is charles@charlesduhigg.com. And the reason I mention that is because like doing this research anyone who sends me an email, I will read it and respond. Like, I think that's the bare minimum of like connection, is to say like, I'm open to responding to you. And so literally anyone who sends, we've already responded to like 27,000 so far, but like,
Jeez, yeah.
But like some of them are like real relationships come out of them, right? Wow. Like there's people who emailed me who I like still email with years later, and we just kind of update each other on our lives.
Wow.
Yeah. So Charles@charlesduhigg.com, or you can just find me online. You can find Super-communicators wherever you buy books, Audible or Amazon or Barnes and Nobles, your local bookstore.
Love it. Well, last question that gets asked every day on the show. What does living a genius life mean to you?
I think living a genius life for me means living a life that feels deeply satisfying, not necessarily deeply happy all the time, right? Because I'm sure you do this too. Like, I do a lot of work that isn't necessarily fun, but it's meaningful. Like there's a sense of satisfaction and of contentedness that comes from doing it. Raising kids is like really can be tough at moments. And yet it's so meaningful. So I think for me, the genius life is a life that at least once a day you can say, like, I did this thing. It feels like it has meaning. It feels important to me to have done it.
So good. I love that.
What is it for you?
Ooh, man. Well, I guess it's dedicating yourself to a life of learning and curiosity.
Yeah.
Learning, keeping an open mind about things. People as they get old, they tend to get mired in their own shtick, whatever that happens to be, the narratives that they've told themselves over the years, about what they can or can't do, who they can or can't be.
Yeah.
And I think, keeping a limber mindset, I think, is one of the keys to staying youthful in mind.
Yeah.
As you get older.
I agree.
Yeah.
I
Being
agree.
kind to yourself, being kind to others.
Yeah.
Really important.
And I think that like part of that limberness is about finding people who are different from us and kind of like investing in that relationship, right? Because it's really easy sometimes just to fall into the trap where we're connecting with people who are just like us and have similar backgrounds. But like, I've just found that like some of my friendships with people who come from such different places, either because of like their ethnicity or their gender or where they grew up or the jobs that they do, like they remind me that there are other ways of seeing the world. And sometimes like I kind of need that reminder. Like I get stuck in my own way of seeing it. So I think what you said is hugely right.
There's a Murakami quote that you reminded me of with your answer. I can bear almost any pain so long as it has meaning, so long as it's meaningful.
Yeah.
And I really love that.
Yeah, me too.
I think I'm paraphrasing it to some degree, but yeah, I mean, life is not easy, right? We both lost loved ones in 2018.
Yeah.
Most difficult thing I've ever had to do. And, but it's given my life tremendous purpose. And
life shouldn't, like, I actually don't want an easy life.
Yeah.
Right? Like, I mean, I'm sure you're the same way. Like, why do you get interested? Like, you push yourself. It is not easy to eat well. It is not easy to exercise. It is not easy to put yourself out there in a career perspective. It's not easy to date, right?
Yeah.
And like put your heart up for like
Story.
Assassination. Like, and yet the reason why we keep running towards these things that aren't easy is because they are meaningful.
Yeah.
So I think there's an inverse relationship there sometimes.
Absolutely. And ultimately so satisfying.
Yeah.
As a result. Well, Charles, thanks for coming in.
Thank you.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.